Thank you all for joining us today for this new reading group session organized by ContinualAI. My name is Vincenzo Lamonaco, and today I'm going to host this reading group session. And today we have the pleasure to host Blake Camp from Georgia State University. He's going to talk about his recent paper, which is called Continual Learning with Deep Artificial Neurons. So thank you so much, Blake, for joining us today, and the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Vincenzo, for having me. And I just want to reiterate that I'm very thankful for all the work that ContinualAI does. And I find a lot of these conversations to be really helpful. So thank you for that. And hopefully I can contribute something and then continue to contribute in the future. So without any hesitation, I'll just go ahead and get into this. If you look in the chat, you'll see that I've provided a link to the paper itself, which I should remind you is just a preprint. So this has not been peer reviewed yet. And then I've attempted to upload the slides themselves, but it's telling me it failed to send for whatever reason. So the reason I mention that is because I'd like to just share my screen to do this presentation. And if anybody wants access to the slides afterwards, obviously I'm happy to provide them. But yeah, so I'll just go ahead and get started. So obviously, continual learning is my primary area of research, even though I'm interested in many different things. And ultimately, I think, you know, as the field progresses, I think we're going to find that there's more and more overlap with other fields, like transfer learning, like OOD, generalization, things like that. So I think that's important to keep in mind as we think about the right way to approach the problem of continual learning, right? Because if we're just solving that problem, it's likely going to be difficult to kind of merge all of these fields in the future, which we know that we have to do. So just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Blake Camp. I'm a PhD student at Georgia State University, and I work with Rolando Estrada, who did his PhD at Duke University, and he has more of a computational neuroscience background. And so he, from the very beginning, has been encouraging me to look for biological inspiration to some of these problems, even though I have more of a computer science background. So with that being said, for the past 2 years or so, I've been thinking about ways to incorporate more powerful models of neurons into artificial systems, and trying to answer the question, why are they beneficial from a theoretical point of view? Because it's one thing to say, okay, we want more biologically faithful models, but until you can quantify or explain why it's beneficial to do that, you know, you're not really contributing that much. I shouldn't, maybe you shouldn't go that far, but you get my point. So there's two key components to what we're doing: deep artificial neurons, and then thinking of synapses or connections between neurons as vectors rather than single variables. So I'll just briefly give some thoughts on continual learning, my motivation for deep artificial neurons, which I call DANs. I'll briefly go over the implementation, our current experiments, more thoughts on continual learning, how I think we might be able to optimize multiple meta objectives at once, and my plan for future research going forward. Okay, so continual learning. In general, the number one thing, the primary driver for my research has been this desire to move away from experience replay or keeping old data. Okay, that's, it's the year 2020, and it's the one method we have where you essentially can guarantee that you'll retain memory over an agent's lifetime. But we know that that's probably not what the brain is doing. And we've seen pretty recently that it's really not necessary. So the papers that are coming out now, if they're using experience replay, it's not that I dismiss those ideas completely, but I'm just less interested. Because I don't think that's going to be the solution for the long term. They might, you're going to have some strong performance over the near term, but really what we're trying to do is have systems or models that scale and do so without keeping old data. So for me, continual learning in streaming environments is the goal. Okay, I'm interested in online updates, so fully online algorithms, ultimately reinforcement learning, very long learning trajectories, sparse rewards and labels, because I think it's important to remember that as humans, we forget a lot more than we remember. And that's why I think active learning will eventually be an important component as well. And then also doing this type of continual learning in multiple contexts or multiple goal environments where you're trying to map the same environmental state to different optimal actions or labels. And then personally, where I'm trying to go is in this continual unsupervised learning field without experience replay. And we know that's a huge necessity for RL agents because it's very helpful to keep a world model, right? So, you build some world model in some compressed latent space, and you can do things like planning there. And so you can plan over sequences of states and actions. And it's important to be able to do that without keeping old data. And then ultimately, I think we're going to be moving in this direction where we start incorporating other ideas, transfer learning, OOD, generalization. And in our lab, we're kind of referring to that as cumulative learning, continual transfer learning, where you're just continually building off prior knowledge and learning faster and more efficiently. And then finally, there's been a lot of talk, I know, in this group about task IDs. And one opinion I have is that it may be time to start using natural language for those task IDs, because that's going to be how we generalize, right? So you train over some distribution of task descriptions, and maybe you want to be able to extrapolate to new instructions that come in the form of natural language. Okay. So with that being said, let's talk about neurons. So real neurons and real brains, we know, are extraordinarily powerful computational units. They do a lot, right? They maintain their internal states, they propagate action potentials, they maintain the state of their synapses, they communicate chemically with these neurotransmitters and neuromodulators. That isn't to say they're the only, intelligent things in the brain. Proteins have, wildly complex structure, and they do all sorts of things. But neurons, they're the ones sending signals, growing new appendages, eliminating others, and they're basically facilitating learning, right? And so over the years, artificial intelligence researchers have attempted to build these models, and the question is, well, how do we distill that complexity down to some manageable form? And the big question, right, the big answer to how they do that is this. This is what artificial neurons do. They just sum the elements of their input vectors, right? So they get some vector as input, and we say sum them up, put it through a threshold, and pass that message. Okay, so how can we do better? So let's start by recognizing that we're imposing a rather large assumption on our neuron models that they should just sum the elements of the input vector. So instead, maybe we can assume that we don't know how neurons are integrating their inbound signals. I assure you, I'm not that smart, and I think it might be helpful to just not attempt to solve that problem directly. So we ask, would it be possible to learn a function which takes an inbound vector as input and does something more complicated than just summing the values? Well, we're pretty good at using ANNs to learn all sorts of things. Could we use or could we learn such a function with an ANN? Okay, but what role are we asking this function to play? Why do we need to learn new functions of neurons? We already know that our models are already quite good at learning all sorts of tasks. Well, could we, for example, learn a function which both facilitates good feed-forward prediction and overcomes catastrophic forgetting by enforcing memory-preserving synaptic updates? And finally, something I'm interested in is just, would this also make sense from a biological perspective? So now we're at this place where we're ready to start thinking about neurons as these more complex functions. And in the paper, we realize them as kind of ironically deep artificial networks. Okay, so that's one half of the puzzle. And the other is synapses and why I think we should think about them as vectors. So in a traditional artificial neural network, synapses are defined by a single variable, which has a magnitude only, interpreted as a strength that scales the activation traversing that connection, right? Vectorized synapses, or VECs, are connections which are vectors. And it's important to understand that they have magnitudes and orientation in dimensions. So VECs, in my opinion, can be regarded as abstractions of multivariable electrochemical concentrations at a single synapse, or multiple synaptic connections between pairs of neurons. Okay, so you can see two neurons here, and there are multiple connections between them, multiple synapses, each having a strength. Excuse me. Okay, so let's try and put it all together, and then I'll talk about why I think you need both DANs and VECs. So this is a model I've been playing with for a while, and you can see that you have these a standard ANN in the blue box. And what you can do is you can convert that topology to a network of DANs by taking each of those nodes and replacing it with a shared little deep neural network, right? Which we call a DAN. Now, importantly, and as I explained in the paper, all of those nodes share the same parameters, right? So you have the same small little network distributed throughout this larger plastic network. And we call that shared parameter vector a neuronal phenotype. So why is it necessary to have both DANs and VECs? So let's consider two neurons and a single variable intermediate connection. Well, that means we have a single degree of freedom, right? We can make it bigger or smaller. And that will make the postsynaptic neuron more or less sensitive to the signal coming from the presynaptic neuron. So this obviously implies that there's a linear relationship between the synaptic update, right, whether we make it bigger or smaller, and the causal effect that it's going to have on the postsynaptic neuron. Okay. So without access to old data, this linear relationship is probably a problem for memory, since the error signal is going to be sending information about the current data only. So let's now convert those two neurons and the intermediate connection to two DANs and an intermediate VECs. right? And recall that this intermediate connection has magnitude and orientation in this example, 3 dimensions. So suppose, for example, the connection between a pair of neurons does not need to be strengthened or weakened, but rather just reoriented. In other words, we just push that vector in a different direction without changing its magnitude. This will induce a causal effect on the postsynaptic neuron that is not dependent solely on the strength of the electrical signal being sent from that presynaptic neuron, right? So the important thing is we're changing the orientation of that connection, but although we're not changing the magnitude of that strength, we're still going to get different behavior from the postsynaptic neuron, right? Without changing the strength, just reorienting it. So a typical synaptic update during backprop works like this. We're all familiar. And it's basically going to be equivalent to whatever the activation is at the presynaptic node and the error signal residing at the postsynaptic node. So again, this update is linearly correlated with that error at the postsynaptic node. And that may not be what we need to preserve memory. So let's say we need to reorient the connection. Even with a constant magnitude, as I mentioned before, this will change the behavior of the postsynaptic neuron. One responsibility of DANs is therefore to warp the gradient signal, which causes the synaptic updates. It takes the error signal residing at that output node and decides how it needs to be used to update the intermediate connection. In other words, we need to learn a function parameterized by phi here, which both interprets the orientation of the feed-forward inbound vector from the presynaptic neuron, and which interprets and warps and distributes the feedback error signal to each element of the intermediate synaptic vector. So if we didn't have a DAN, but we still vectorize our synapses, and you kept your simple sum and fire neurons, you'd have something like this. You'd have the same presynaptic activation being sent along 3 connections, and then you'd just be summing them up. And that would represent the total contribution of the presynaptic node to the behavior of the postsynaptic node. In other words, the causal effect is, again, just linearly correlated with the magnitude of that vector. It has nothing to do with the orientation. The orientation doesn't matter. So the resulting gradient would scale each of these elements by the same amount, thereby changing only the magnitude and not its orientation, meaning you're not getting any benefit from these additional variables since the postsynaptic causal effect is linearly correlated with the magnitude of that vector. So I was very inspired by a paper called Warped Gradient Descent, and I'm not sure if other people really noticed this paper when it came out, and I certainly missed it the first time. And I think it's because the continual learning experiments that were done were actually very minor. They were just similar to what we did, simple regression problems in kind of a streaming setting or iterative setting. But it was really quite fascinating to me because, again, it's basically an online algorithm. And what they do is they interleave these warp layers between the standard layers of a typical neural network. So you just get this overlapping kind of motif. And obviously, similar to what we do, they meta-learn those warp layers, and then they fix them during deployment. And what the warp layers do is they guide the learning, they guide the updates for the standard layers, which are H here. So if we took a look at this, and we took a look at some of the structure in the brain, we were simply asking, does it make sense that there would be kind of fixed layers of synapses interleaved between plastic layers? And that really didn't make a lot of sense to us. So we went back to our model and we noticed that, if you have a layer of DANs and if they're just network parameters, maybe we can start thinking as neurons as being responsible for that warping of the gradients, right? So if you have a layer of DANs and synapses are between each layer of DANs, you could think of neurons as taking that responsibility. And this is more biologically feasible than, I think, the standard warped gradient descent approach. The other benefit, of course, is that layers of DANs are not fully connected, right? In fact, we just have a single small parameter vector, which is distributed throughout every layer, throughout every neuron in this network. So the bottom line is we only need to store literally several orders of magnitude fewer parameters than we would if we were using the standard warp gradient descent. Because we don't need to store all these fully connected layers, we just need to store one small little parameter vector. So in short, I think this is why we need both DANs and VEX. And again, we set out to learn a single parameter vector. It's distributed and shared by all DANs in the network. We call that a neuronal phenotype, since those parameters define the behavior of all of the DANs. And most importantly, it's end-to-end differentiable, which makes meta-learning and the optimization process quite easy. So what makes this different than just a standard feed-forward ANN with a unique architecture? So in my opinion, the distributed common parameters, you also have a repeated motif of expansion and compression, right? So you're expanding a signal and then compressing it and expanding it and compressing it. And then you also have this interesting property, which is it's related to attention, but this is not something that I formalized. And it's a kind of recurrence without recurrence. And what I mean by that is, since each of these DANs are the same model, when I'm sending a signal as output from this layer, it's being sent along these connections, these VEX, and it's being sent back through what is essentially the same model. It's just conceptually in the next layer here. So you have the same model kind of iteratively compressing its own output in a manner. So that's interesting. And again, it's not something I've completely formalized yet, but it is an interesting property that I've noticed. So also, I think it's important to think about the compatibility with meta-learning and evolution. And so we know that meta-learning has been quite beneficial and is very powerful. And certainly MAML has been a very popular technique. But we've also been asking, does it really make sense to learn priors over synaptic weights from a biological perspective? And to us, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Because we know how plastic the brain is. I mean, there are certainly regions of the brain that are largely held fixed after early development, but it's not like, a child is born and they already have a good parameter distribution over all of their synapses. So we think maybe it makes more sense to encode this kind of inductive bias inside neurons instead. And then we're also interested in the possibility of what happens when we start learning neuronal phenotypes over populations of agents deployed in different environments. So if you deploy a lot of these models and they're all operating in different environments and different learning trajectories, and then you start kind of combining these phenotypes between different agents or models, we think that might open up some interesting possibilities as well. Okay, so the experiments we've done so far, obviously relatively simple. And I'll just let you refer to the paper for a little bit more detail, but I was interested in the experiment put forth in warped gradient descent, where you have to do, it's a regression problem, and you're trying to fit to a complete function, but you're only exposed to part of that function at a particular moment in time, right? So you can think of each of these slices of the function as subfunctions, and the objective is to learn each of them sequentially, one after the other. And we do quite well on that task. And you know, it could be that this is just a really simple problem, and it's, you know, there's a lot of regularity in the data. So if I'm good at predicting, you know, over this subfunction, maybe that's going to help me in my predictions later on. And you know, regularities have that that property, right? So if I know that my current the function that I'm currently trying to fit to is likely very similar to things I've seen in the past, that also opens up the possibility for, you know, things like backwards transfer. Okay. So forwards and backwards transfer are only possible if such regularities exist in the data, of course. Right? You're not going to be able to do it if it's just a random function. Okay, so currently what we're doing is this. I've mentioned that I'm interested in continual unsupervised learning without experience replay. And what I can say is, and I won't give away too many details, but this is starting to work, right? So the idea is you have some autoencoder where the nodes are DANs, essentially, and what you're trying to do is sequentially compress data sets in such a way that you don't need to replay the data. So basically what I'm trying to do is meta-train on things like Omniglot, and then deploy the model on MNIST, make one pass over the data, and then have a pretty well-defined latent space and good reconstructions. And I think this is doable. And like I said, we're starting to see some promising results. And the reason I'm interested in doing that, of course, is, as I mentioned, it's important for agents to have this ability to continually model their environment, to have some model of the dynamics of the world, right? And they need to be able to do this without keeping old data. And of course, that only really makes sense if you're interested in embodiment, right? Because embodiment means that you're going to be working with limited memory and limited resources. So you need to be very efficient about how you go about learning. So ultimately, there's another guy in our lab who is a game designer, and he has some pretty interesting environments. And hopefully this is going to play. And so I think it would be great to do some kind of continual learning in an environment like this. This is especially interesting to me because you could, in theory, incorporate natural language instructions within the environment itself, right? So you could, the idea would be to either do continual object classification, or, as you'll see in a second, maybe some simple instruction following where you have to use some of these items. So this will be challenging, but I actually, if we solve the problem that I was just talking about, where you have this ability to continually model the world, I think something like this is probably achievable, but obviously I don't want to overpromise, right? Okay. And so finally, I just want to talk about what I'm calling cumulative learning, or optimizing many meta objectives at once. And if you go through the paper, you see basically what we do is we quantify a memory loss experienced by the agent, and that memory loss is what we're trying to minimize. Okay, but there's nothing restricting us from just adding additional terms as long as we can quantify forward transfer, quantify backwards transfer, and quantify OOD generalization. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be easy to implement in just a single end-to-end model. You may need some modular structure there or communication between different kind of modules. But I think when the right solution starts to present itself, you'll have some meta loss like this, which is just very easy to formulate, and then you can just optimize everything all at once. So I'm not saying we're there yet. I just have a suspicion that a good solution to many of these problems will kind of harmonize all of these different components in some sort of easily optimizable loss function. And that's all I have for today. And of course, I'm eager to hear criticism. Yeah, that would be the most important thing. Any sort of feedback would be very much appreciated. So thank you guys, and I guess I'll take questions now.
Thank you so much, Blake, for your very interesting and I would say mind-blowing presentation. I mean, your ideas are surely very original. I agree with many of the also ideas that you shared, like more broadly ideas about continual learning. Thank you for those as well. So maybe I can start with a question myself. So these DANs, they have, they can have like a complex structure, or any structure that we desire, or they are planned to be like a simple 2 layers neural networks as you show in the pictures?
Yeah, I don't think that there's anything preventing more complex structures. And I think that's a great area of research. It's been really strange because there was a talk at NeurIPS a couple of years ago, I think, by Blaise Aguera, who was talking about things very similar to this, and he presented some preliminary results, but as far as I'm aware, he never followed up with a publication, even though in principle it's more or less the same idea. He was using very small LSTMs for the neurons and the synapses. So I think something like that could work. And there are a couple other people working on similar ideas. But in general, I think essentially what you're describing is I think there's an opportunity to learn multiple neuronal phenotypes and learn why they're beneficial, why it's beneficial to have multiple types of neurons, as opposed to just a single type. We were just interested in investigating whether or not it was possible to use one of these types of neurons, but there's nothing saying that has to be the case. You could have one type per layer. You could have multiple types of neurons within a layer. You could have recurrent feedback connections. There's nothing preventing that.
Okay. Let's see, maybe we question in the chat if you want to look at that.
Yes, so the question is, can you elaborate more on the intuition behind weight sharing in the DANs? What happens if the weights are different? So if you look at the paper, and maybe I can share my screen one more time. So we did actually investigate that. Okay, so in this figure 4, I have 3 different models. Net zero, which is kind of this cyan, this light blue. This is a model where all the DANs share the same parameters. I also have another model where each layer of DANs shares the same parameters, but there are different phenotypes for each layer. And then the last plot, this net 2, there's no parameter sharing between DANs. So my thoughts on that are, it may not be necessary to have a single neuronal phenotype. You may be able to get faster learning if there's no parameter sharing. But I think that the benefit from having just a single type or that parameter sharing that you're talking about is the compressive benefit, right? If I only need to store one set of parameters, that's obviously going to drastically reduce my memory footprint, and it may make things easier to encode in a genome, right? If I'm just encoding a single set of parameters, that may be very easy to pass on from one generation to the next, for example. So I definitely think that's one potential benefit.
Well, I have an observation and a question also. So thank you for your talk, because it has been very, very interesting. So I was wondering if there is any possible connections between your approach and sort of convolutional neural networks in which you share parameters for the filter. So instead of let's say using more phi in each layer, maybe stacking and different phi's in each layer, so to improve, I don't know, computational capabilities of the model.
Yeah, so that's actually what we're currently working on, and it's not something I'm ready to fully discuss right now, because like I said, it's part of our current research. But I would say it's your intuition is exactly right, and it's very helpful to think about things in that way. And so yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And another one, but I guess I'm receiving the same answer here, but I have to ask. The implications, or I kind of know that you are working on also on recurrent neural networks extension of this work. So I have to ask if you can tell us more about this, or if this is also a preliminary work, so it's hard for you to say.
Yeah, what I can say is I'm interested in the continual unsupervised learning that we talked about, which is you need to be able to extract features from natural images, and you need to be able to reconstruct them to high fidelity, right? And so you need to think about, in my opinion, not only how this makes sense from a conceptual point of view, how to incorporate this idea of DANs in your model, but then it's also very helpful to think about, well, what tools do we already have at our disposal, which are very fast and efficient in some of these machine learning libraries, right? So, for example, when I was first playing with these models, things were very slow, because I was not putting things together in the right way that was going to make for fast optimization using some of PyTorch and things like that. So right now we're interested in, how does this make sense from a conceptual point of view, using the existing libraries and packages and things like that. And I would just say that I think that there's a way to do it, and so that's what we're currently working on.
Okay, thank you very much.
Right. So Blake, I have another question. So are you planning to now? I know that you have ambitions of working in more realistic and interesting continual learning settings without too much supervision, and maybe we using sparse labels in our personal learning settings, or even the beautiful environment that you showed in the video. But I think it would be very interesting to see how your method perform like on very simple and standard benchmarks that are currently using in Vision for continual learning, like a split MNIST or something like that. Do you have a plan to apply your method also in those cases? Because I believe that would be very useful for showcasing your method and let researchers in this field like really appreciate what you're doing in their own, let's say, context of application, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think benchmarks are extremely important. Ultimately, you have to have some way of comparing methods, right? And I know that that's been difficult, and especially for continual learning, because the experimental standard keeps changing almost every few months. There's some new data set, or I will say, yeah, I have a plan for that, but I also wanted to think about an experiment where I basically know that existing techniques will fail, right? So I think if you have now we're talking about how do you get a paper published? It's not like I have a huge track record yet, but I think benchmarks are certainly important. And then if you can add one or two experiments where other techniques just fail categorically, then that is also compelling, right? But it's not like you can just do one or the other, I think. So yeah, my feeling right now is if I can do this sequential encoding or sequential reconstruction of images, I basically know I can do sequential classification. But that's nothing new. I mean, you have animal, you have some of these other meta learning approaches where you can do that incremental object classification without keeping old data. We've seen, and it's not terribly different. It's like you want to meta learn some parts of your model, some innate structure, which give an inductive bias to your system and allow for easy, efficient learning. And all we're doing is just providing a different way of encoding inductive bias into a model. That's all. That's all.
Yeah. So, but essentially, I mean, the basic idea of these dance, right, and they're in conjunction with these vecs, is that you can address catastrophic forgetting, right? Also, I mean, you can tame that, so you can show their effectiveness in every kind of scenario in which there is forgetting, theoretically. And yeah, well, so I think also in those more simpler cases in which you have like labels and you have small batches, you can. I mean, the key aspect that many people will be interested in to understand the impact on forgetting and plasticity of this technique, right? That you're proposing. So that's a simple case in which everyone know the rules. Let's say everyone know what you're trying to solve, but you can study the inner mechanisms that allow continual learning, like the focus on that. I'm just saying, I was hinting to this the previous question.
Yeah, for the time being, I haven't focused on the multi-context learning or multi-label learning. That's not, I think it's an important problem. But that's also why I think, until there's a common agreement about how to do that, what types of task IDs or labels should we be using, is difficult to compare. So that's why I just mentioned, I think, it might be time to start using language as a description for a task. And so, but that is not something that I'm currently working on. We'll just have to leave that for the future. But I think it's really important. I agree.
I mean, do we have other questions from the audience or from the other people that are still here? Of course, you can ask your question, opening your mic, or you can write it down on the chat. Even observations or comments are welcome.
And if not today, I just want to say that, if anyone wants to email me with criticism or comments, I'm more than happy to have a discussion through email. So, yeah.
That's great. But maybe we can close with one last question that I have in mind. So, or maybe a clarification just to wrap up. So this idea of dance, I was thinking is about like kind of operating as a switch to somehow protect some weights and allow training just on one particular weight. I mean, can be like a narrative for the inner working of this, or there are other more clear explanation of why this can protect your network from forgetting.
Yeah, I think that there's all sorts of ablation studies that we could do to examine how the weights are evolving over time. And for example, as I kind of touched on, I think it would be interesting to examine scenarios where you have an error signal at the postsynaptic node, but the DAN decides not to change the magnitude of the connection, but just to reorient that vector. So that would provide some clarification or some idea that idea is correct, right? That it may not. What you might want to do is not necessarily strengthen or weaken a connection, but you're just trying to get different contextual behavior from your postsynaptic neuron. So yeah,
but again, this orientation has to be changed back, right? When you're facing again the same situation, or there's a because you are preserving maybe the strength of that connection, but then
yeah. I mean, it's just not a question I can answer at the moment. It's it's something I'm interested in, I'm curious about, but we'll just have to leave that for another day. I just don't know.
All these explanations and ablation studies would be very useful.
Yeah, very good question. Very good question. Okay.
Right. So if we don't have any more questions, I thank you again, Blake, for your time and your great talk. It was very inspiring, I guess. And I invite you to maybe post your slides directly, the link to your slides directly on our forum, where I have a topic ready there for you.
Okay.
And we can continue the discussion over there as well. If anyone is interested in asking more questions. And I invite you all instead to join our next reading group session this Friday, the next Friday, on 11th November, where we are gonna host the first author of the work "Learn More, Forget Less: Cues from the Human Brain," Arijit Patra from Oxford University. So you're all invited to join. Will be a nice talk about also this time about a bit biological inspiration for continual learning. Thank you again for joining, and I'll see you then.
Thanks, Vincenzo.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.